In task 8, we are gain staging the audio files using the clip gain function. Remember that the clip gain is being applied to the actual audio files. So in this case, and for this particular task, you are not touching the faders at the moment. You are messing right here with the clip gain function in the lower left-hand corner of the file with this little fader. Now, if you don't see this here, you can go up to View, go to Clip, and make sure that you have the clip gain info present. If that's not there, this is the way it'll look. So View, Clip, clip gain info. Make sure that you don't add the clip gain line, just because once we get to volume automation later on down in the month, it may be confusing to see that line and the volume automation line. Students tend to confuse the two of them, and I don't want you guys to do that. So if you'll notice, most of my tracks already have another value other than 0 in it, and what I've done is put this base DI track at 0, which is where you will see all of your levels for all of your tracks, right? So it defaults to 0, and then what we're having you do is set this level so that this audio peaks at -6 dBFS. So what you're going to do is pull up the Audio Suite plugin, and you want to make sure that it's on peak levels, so analyzing peak levels, and all you're going to do is highlight the file and analyze it. And in this case, you see that it's at -4.6, which means that you have to turn it down to get it to peak at -6 dBFS. So what you have to do, hold down the command key so that you can turn your clip gain fader down in smaller increments. And in this case, if you're not good at math, it's okay. You can do the calculation on the side. I'm going to have to turn it down to about -1.5 dB. Let's see. I think I messed up there. -1.5. And to check your work, just say you're not comfortable with your math, just analyze it one more time. And it says -1.6, so I'll turn it down one more. Analyze again. Oh, I went too far, right? So go up, -1.4, -6. There we go, right? So you can be in the ballpark. I don't expect you to be exactly at -6 for each file, but be very close to it, because that's where you want your files to peak at. So remember, in this case, I'm not hitting render. I don't want you guys to render the file. If you render the file, it means that it creates new files, new versions of the audio files, and when you send me the session, I won't be able to open up your audio. So make sure that you're only using this to analyze, and then using your clip gain fader to turn it down or turn it up by the amount that it needs to be to hit at -6 dBFS. After completing the clip gain function or task, you want to move on to gain staging the master output with your faders. What we mean by that is, once you have all these values completed and input correctly, you'll notice that all of your faders are still at 0, right? Which means that your master output level is probably pretty loud, so you can go to the loudest section of your song, and for each final project song it's going to be a little bit different, but for this practice song, it's here at the end. So I'm going to play this, and please be careful with your ears when I do play it. I just want you to see the output level. Right, so we're well above the -3 max level, and in reality you should be hovering around -6 with your levels, with occasional peaks at -3 dBFS, right? So what we want to do now to get that under control before we actually start mixing everything is to activate your All Audio Tracks mix group, play the track again in that area, and then turn down all of your audio faders together till you get it to about hovering around -6. So I'm going to leave it right around there. And notice that all of your subgroup faders are at 0 dB. They're still at 0 dB, and your master fader is at 0 dB. So your master fader will always stay at 0 dB at nominal, right? You don't ever want to touch that. If you're having troubles because your mix is going above the max level, then that means that you have to go back to your mix faders and at later stages to your subgroup faders to start turning things down from there. The next thing we want to do is to balance our faders. So now we can start adjusting things slowly, right? Because we don't really have a lot of processing on our tracks at the moment. What we're going to do is just start adjusting things in a general sense. So the way to do that is to first off turn off the all audio tracks mix group, then jump in and activate all of your mix groups, not the all, but drums, bass, e-guitar, acoustic guitar, and these guys here, right? So we have all of our subgroups activated, or sorry, our mix groups activated. And what we want to do is start attacking our balance, our mix balance, by just looking at the larger picture and trying to balance it out by the groups, right? By all the by how we've grouped everything, and then also our lead vox and background vocals. So we can play the song from the top, and then just start balancing things out. So I'm going to play it from right where everything comes in. Right, so you go in, spend some time leveling or balancing everything out as a group, right? So everything in its own mix groups. Then you can go in there, turn these off, and start attacking the individual faders. Once you have a basic level, you can go in there and say, you know what, my hi-hat is too loud. I'm going to turn it down just a little bit. Maybe my bass cab needs a little bit more presence. I like the balance when my cab is a little bit louder. My snare and my kick need to come up, so I'm going to turn those up, right? Things like that. E-guitar 2 is too loud, I'm going to turn it down. So you start balancing things out. So each mix fader should have some level of adjustment within your mix. Remember though, don't touch the subgroup faders, leave those where they're at. Beyond that, and of course, I think before I forget, more importantly, make sure that you're always looking at your master output, because before this you set everything up to be hovering around -6, right? So instead of attacking your mix and turning things up, right? Because the more you turn things up, the more that master output level goes up. What you want to do is turn the things that are too loud down. Start thinking of things that way. Okay, if I'm at a good place and my master output level, it means that everything that's a little bit too loud has to come down a little bit. So if I want to hear my vocal a little bit more, right, maybe I got to turn everything else down just a bit so that I can hear my vocal. And of course, you can turn up your vocal just a bit. You know, it's not against the rules to turn things up just a bit. But the more that you start thinking of subtractive as opposed to additive, the better it's going to be. Once we get beyond that, once you get a good handle on your basic level to where your master output is not peaking above that max level, you then want to jump into some tools and concepts that are going to help you with getting your mix in a good place, getting a good blend, and getting a good strong relationship between all of your instruments, and jumping into phase and your phase correlation and how that helps the balance and the blend and the focus between your instruments and the strength and focus of your instruments is going to be very important. So on this task, what you want to do is pull up the stereo tool, and you want to again make sure if you haven't closed your session, then you should still be on the stereo and mono presets, right? You should be able to go between them, but if not, make sure that you load them up. In this case, we're going to be on the stereo side, right? And I want you guys to look at this, and when we play the mix, there's going to be a little, almost like it's the phase scope image, but it's a blob that basically dances and shows you the how everything lands within the stereo field, right? And when it's a very complex relationship, like adding all of these instruments together and having this interpreted, you're going to see it dance around quite a bit, right? The more that you pan things out, the more that you get things into the stereo field. In the beginning, since everything is panned up the center, you're probably just going to see a straight line showing you that everything is in mono, right? And then, of course, looking down here at the phase correlation meter below the level meters, it's a small meter that shows you a little box, a red box right in the center, and that's the 0 value, and then there's the +1 on the right-hand side and the -1 on the left-hand side. Simply put, you want your phase correlation meter, the little box, to be dancing mainly between 0 and +1, and the closer to +1 it is, the better. And that signifies that whatever instruments are being played and monitored at the moment, the closer they are to +1, the more strongly correlated they are, right? And the less cancellation there is between the waveforms, right? So if we, let's say, just as an exercise, if we pull up the bass right here, right, and we solo it, and notice that the bass tracks are panned up the center, and so is the subgroup that it's going to. It's panned up the center. And so if I play this, let's look for the bass. Let's play it right here. Right, so played it. It's basically telling me that it's mono, that it's up the center, that there is no stereo information with this track. And that's true, because everything is panned up the center. But if I were to pan this out like this, and I play it, it's still up the center. So if you look at your routing, you'll see that, and this is a good lesson, if you look at your routing, you'll see that your bass audio tracks are being routed to the input of your bass subgroup. Now look at your bass subgroup, it's panned up the center. No matter how much panning you do on the tracks being routed to the subgroup, if the subgroup that they're being routed to is panned up the center, you will not hear that panning. It will always be mono, right? So if you want to hear the panning that you applied to your tracks that are being routed to a subgroup, make sure that the subgroup is panned hard left and hard right. Just like that, right? Now when I play this, you'll see that this is going to change. Right, so now it's showing me that there's some stereo information. But back to what we were doing, if I pan these back up the center so that you can hear, and now I'm going to pan the two bass tracks out. Pan them back up. Right, so when they were panned both out towards the left and the right, you can immediately sense that there's like, not only visually can you see it, but sonically you can almost hear like there's a hole in the center, like it's hollow, like you can't place the bass in a particular space within the left and the right stereo field. But when it's panned up the center, you feel that it's strong, that it's focused, that it's hitting you right in the center. Right, so that's important to realize. Let me pan them back out, and also pay attention to the phase correlation meter down at the bottom and look at where it's dancing. So you notice that there at the end, it starts getting even farther away from +1, right? So that is a sign that whatever tracks are being monitored, there's not a good phase correlation or a strong phase correlation between whatever elements are being monitored, and you have to be careful, which means that you have to start pushing things more towards the +1, right? Whereas when things are up the center, like this, generally in mono, everything's going to be, well, everything in mono is going to be a strong +1, right? Because there is no stereo information. But to get things to fall back onto the +1, there are changes that you can make, right? Because that having them closer to 0 means that there's cancellation happening between two or more waveforms, which means that to improve upon that, you have to start changing either the frequency content with EQ, the amplitude with the volume, or the timing, right? So you start moving waveforms around, right? And we don't have to get too crazy with that, but we're going to show you some of those tasks a little bit later on in this exercise. So that's how you interpret your phase correlation meter. Moving on from that task, and of course I want you guys to go through the exercises that are in here. There's a couple more exercises that we have you do to start understanding the phase correlation a little bit more. But then we also want you to check the mix in mono and to understand what the advantages are to doing something like this, right? So in this case, what you're going to do is put your stereo flux tool in mono, which means that now no matter how much panning you have in your session, right? No matter if your subgroups are panned out, if everything is being fed to this master output and this stereo tool is on mono, everything is going to be heard up the center no matter what. It's just going to fold everything down to the center, which means that there's no stereo information. But when you fold everything down up the center, it's a lot easier to hear when things maybe are out of phase or when there's some cancellation happening between two or more instruments, right? Because they're all kind of piled up on top of each other. So if you, in this first example, if you're to solo the 2 snare tracks and add an EQ 7 band, right? And then throw another one on the other side, and we play the snare wherever it's at. So right now it's just up the center. Right, so pretty decent snare sound. And it's both of these snare tracks, the snare top and the snare bottom. So that's 2 microphones, one pointed at the top of the snare, one pointed at the bottom of the snare. And what we're going to do is we're going to test out flipping the polarity on one of these snare tracks, which means that you're taking the waveform and you're flipping it 180 degrees, so basically almost upside down, right? And sometimes by doing that, you can actually improve the relationship between one track and another track or multiple tracks, right? It's not necessarily a proper solution, but it is a band-aid after the fact. If things have been recorded the way that they are at the moment, right? And there's nothing you can do as the mix engineer. You're receiving things that are already recorded. So what you can do is try out things like this, like flipping the polarity to maybe gain a better relationship between 2 or more instruments. But in reality, this should be addressed in the recording phase, right? Make sure that the phase relationship between everything being recorded is the strongest possible. So I'm going to play the snare, and then I'm going to flip one of the snares 180 degrees, and you're going to hear the difference between the 2 tracks. So in terms of strength and focus, when the polarity is not flipped, the snare sounds a lot stronger, right? It sounds a lot stronger. It sounds a lot more focused in the center. When you hit it and you flip it 180 degrees, you hear this kind of washed out snare. It's a little bit weaker and it's kind of sitting in the back. Not to say that one is better than the other, It's just a different sound, right? But if we're talking about strength and correlation and focus, the one that's not flipped sounds better, which means that whoever recorded this took care to make sure that all of the stuff was correlated well. So generally in this practice session, most everything is correlated pretty well and strongly. But in the exercise PDF, you'll see that there are a couple more exercises that we have you go through to test this out. Just make sure that when you're done with this task that you go back to your stereo flux tool and you flip your plug-in to the stereo side, because you want to be hearing everything in stereo for the most part.